Hi everyone. This week we're talking about Kant's moral philosophy. Kant is known as a deontologist, which is also falls under the category called non-consequentialism. The reason that it falls under this category is because Kant does not believe that we should do what's right because of the consequences that may or may not occur. Now, that doesn't mean that he isn't concerned with consequences. He just doesn't think that consequences have to do with our moral intentions. He believes that we should do what's right solely because it is right, and we're going to talk about that in a little more detail. Now, I've made a list of the different things that Kant supports and his various ideas in order to make it a little bit easier for you. One of the things to note about his philosophy is that people, he's very heavily into the idea that people should not be used, and therefore that's another reason he doesn't like consequentialism. He believes that consequentialism leads to a person having instrumental value, and that means that the person is used for a particular purpose. Kant doesn't agree with that. Instead, he believes that people have intrinsic value, which means that people have moral worth internally and therefore should be treated respectfully and with value no matter what. So we cannot use them as a means to accomplishing some sort of goal. And I think that offers up a nice solution to some of the ideas that we discussed in consequentialism and some of the problems that came about as far as using people as a goal and evaluating their worth on whether or not they would contribute to the greater good. Another key thing about Kant's philosophy is that you should act out of duty. And this is something you're probably very familiar with if you serve in the military, have done any volunteer work, etc. So you may feel obligated, for example, to serve your country. You may feel that that is a duty that you have. There isn't anything underlying that duty. It's just that you believe that it is a duty to serve your country. It is a duty to volunteer in civic service. And so these duties are moral rights, or they're morally motivated. So it isn't necessarily based off of your particular want or personal desire, but instead it is based off of a more universal idea. So the next key point then is that Kant's theory is universal in nature. That means that the morals that we set out to follow should be able to be followed by every person, everywhere. Now that means even in different cultures and those that hold different beliefs from us. Obviously, this is one of the key problems with Kant's philosophy, but it also makes it successful. For example, some cultures, as you learned in cultural relativism, hold different beliefs than we do. So other people will argue that we can't follow Kant's philosophy because people in other cultures do hold different beliefs, and we need to honor those beliefs. Something that serves really well as a good demonstration of some moral oughts that fall under Kant's ideas of universal moral law would be the human Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that's used by the United Nations and other countries across the world. These are seen as moral oughts for the treatment of other human beings and their intrinsic worth. And it's felt that humans should be treated this way regardless of what culture they belong to. So that's a really good example of what Kant's talking about. Now, as you were reading, you probably noticed that there were two different kinds of imperatives. An imperative is just a statement about something that you should do. And you'll notice that the book outlined there were different kinds of imperatives. A hypothetical imperative, and then also a categorical imperative. A hypothetical imperative is something that has to do with your own particular desires and wants, and it is not universally needed. So if you want to write your name on the top of the test paper, that could be seen as a hypothetical imperative. If somebody tells you to close the door and you feel like closing the door because you desire to do so, that could be a hypothetical imperative. There isn't any moral obligation in a hypothetical imperative. Now, in a categorical imperative, this is where you see the moral motivation. This is what we talked about before. It needs to be universalized. This is not dependent on your own desires and wants, but is dependent on the desires and wants that everybody shares because they are human. And we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about natural law theory. So a categorical imperative would be something like you ought not to kill other people. That's something that can be universally implied, and it has an element of morality or moral motivation in it. Another thing that you should be aware of with Kant is that there are two different forms discussed in the text. Even though there are more, there are only two different forms that are touched on here. And that first form talks about you can only do something that can be universalized. And the second form has to do with intrinsic worth. So as you can see, we've already touched on those two forms that fall into the essential elements of the categorical imperative. Now, I know that this can be a bit of a tricky philosophy, and many philosophers spend their lifetime dedicating their own personal work to studying Kant. So if you have any questions about Kant, please feel free to post a message here after the video or send me an email, and I look forward to discussing more about Kant with you today.